Imagine leaving pristine biological evidence at like 11 separate crime scenes. You're spotted by an eyewitness literally running into the night. You have your exact psychological methods profiled by the FBI. And you still just vanish into thin air for over 2 decades.
It's almost impossible to
Yeah.
believe, right? But it happens.
It does. Today is Monday, March 30, 2026. And, you sent us this massive, intense stack of sources today. And we're looking at a case where the investigative science eventually worked flawlessly, but the custodial system holding it all together just completely shattered.
Right. It is the absolute definition of a fragile pursuit of justice. I mean, we all want to believe the legal system is this airtight linear machine, right, where evidence goes in one end and a conviction just pops out the other.
Exactly. And this clean process.
But cases like this, they expose how easily those gears jam or just break down entirely when they're pushed to their limits by, evolving science and jurisdictional borders.
Yeah, welcome to the deep dive, by the way. And looking at the sources you provided, we've got D.C. Superior Court records, forensic criminology reports, an Indiana Law Journal article on genetic privacy, which is fascinating, plus deep dive investigations into the D.C. jail system, true crime podcast transcripts, and even, randomly, a 1998 Sri Lankan legal text.
It's quite the mix, but it all connects perfectly.
It really does, because to understand how this case ultimately broke the system, we have to look at the sheer terrifying scale of what law enforcement was dealing with back in the early 1990s. So our mission today is to trace the chilling timeline, the capture, and the, highly controversial end of the Potomac River rapist, Giles Daniel Warrick.
Yeah, and this isn't just a basic recount of crimes. It's really a profound exploration of how a predator evaded the law for decades using very calculated psychological tactics. And, it requires looking closely at how revolutionary science finally caught him when traditional detective work just hit a wall.
Right.
And ultimately how systemic institutional failures denied his victims their day in court.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start in Montgomery County, Maryland, because the frequency of these early attacks, it demonstrates an offender operating with just terrifying impunity.
He was completely unrestrained.
Exactly. He struck 4 times in just the final 8 months of 1991. We're talking about May 6 in Gaithersburg, then September 5 in Germantown, November 21 in Bethesda, and December 11 in North Potomac.
Yeah.
Every few weeks, another home was breached, and another woman was subjected to a horrific ordeal.
And, in forensic criminology, that kind of rapid geographic clustering, it indicates an offender in a state of high predatory arousal and really situational comfort.
He felt confident.
Very confident. He felt in absolute control of his hunting ground. He wasn't just lashing out randomly, right? He was executing a very specific plan.
And the sources detail his modus operandi, his MO, in minute detail. And we're not going to censor the reality of the terror he inflicted here, because his methods are exactly what allowed him to evade capture for so long.
Right. You have to understand the methods to understand the evasion.
Yeah. So Warrick was a professional landscaper. He possessed an intimate, almost structural knowledge of residential layouts, and he weaponized this mundane profession. Before he even forced entry into a home, usually in the evening, by the way, he would physically cut the external phone lines.
Which is a critical tactical signature. Think about it. In 1991, cutting a phone line didn't just delay a police response.
Right. No cell phones.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It trapped the victim in an analog void. He completely isolated his victims from the outside world before they even knew he had breached the perimeter of their home.
It's terrifying.
It really is. And upon forcing entry, he utilized another distinct tactic, which was environmental and sensory manipulation. He would immediately throw blankets, towels, or items of clothing over his victims' heads.
And it wasn't just a crude way to hide his face either. It was a mechanism of psychological control, right?
Yeah.
Designed to induce total sensory deprivation and helplessness.
Yes.
He plunged his victims into the dark, making them entirely dependent on his commands, stripping away their spatial awareness.
Because the deprivation of sight, it induces an immediate trauma response. The victim, they can't anticipate the next blow or the next movement or even the location of the weapon. It's a calculated method to enforce compliance through sheer terror.
He also engaged them verbally, which is incredibly chilling to read about. He made comments proving he had been stalking them, noting exactly when they got home from work or returned from grocery shopping.
He was watching them.
Always watching. And the victims, he attacked a teenage babysitter. He attacked women returning to their safe spaces. In some cases, he executed these brutal sexual assaults while the victims' children were present in other rooms of the house.
It shows a complete callous disregard for the risk of detection.
It really does. And the juxtaposition of his daytime profession and his nighttime violence is just stark. He used his landscaping business as camouflage.
Yeah, it was the perfect cover.
You know, that actually mirrors the mechanism we saw in the American Nightmares podcast source you provided about the Zion Society cult in Utah.
Oh, right, with Arvin Shreves.
Exactly. In that case, cult leader Arvin Shreve hid unimaginable systematic abuse behind the manicured lawns and flower gardens of a quiet subdivision. The facade of suburban normalcy provided the perfect cover.
It makes people look the other way.
Yeah, and Warrick operated the exact same way. I mean, he was literally the guy manicuring the lawns. He hid his predatory nature right behind the everyday routine of suburban yard work, quietly observing the vulnerabilities of the homes he was paid to maintain.
What's fascinating here is the sudden cessation of his crimes, though.
Oh, the gap in the timeline.
Right. After an attack in North Potomac on January 24, 1992, the timeline goes completely dark for 2 years.
Just stops.
There are no known attacks until March 8, 1994, in Rockville. And in forensic criminology, a gap of that length is highly significant.
Because usually they escalate, right?
Exactly. So a pause often suggests a temporary stabilization in the offender's life. This could mean a new relationship that temporarily suppresses the urges, or maybe a geographic relocation, or even a period of incarceration for an unrelated crime.
But whatever suppressed his impulses, it was definitely temporary.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when the predatory arousal returned, his hunting ground expanded. By mid-1996, Warrick crossed jurisdictional lines. He moved out of the Maryland suburbs and right into Washington, D.C. On July 20, 1996, he sexually assaulted a 58-year-old woman while she was walking in the Palisades neighborhood.
And this jurisdictional shift introduces what criminologists call linkage blindness.
Linkage blindness.
Yeah. By crossing the border into D.C., he essentially reset the investigative clock.
Yeah.
Different police departments, using different databases and completely different filing systems, were basically operating in silos.
So it's like two different police departments putting together the edges of the exact same jigsaw puzzle in different rooms, completely unaware they are building the same picture.
That is precisely how it functioned. And that linkage blindness bought him time. It set the stage for the ultimate escalation of his violence, which brings us to August 1st, 1998, and the only victim explicitly named in the public records of this spree.
Right, Christine Mirzayan. She was a brilliant biochemist, just 29 years old, though. You know, some of the sources cite her as 28. And she was a fellow at the National Academy of Sciences.
Such a tragic loss.
Unbelievably tragic. And the details of the attack on her, it represents a violently chaotic departure from his previous patterns of residential home invasions. Tracing her final steps, she was walking home from a friend's cookout in Georgetown around 10:30 p.m.
Right.
And Warrick intercepted her on the 3600 block of Canal Road, NW. He dragged her into a wooded area. She was sexually assaulted and then murdered via blunt force trauma to the head. And the weapon he used, it was a massive 73-pound rock.
I mean, the sheer physical strength required to wield a 73-pound rock as a weapon is just staggering. It corroborated later witness descriptions of a highly athletic male suspect, and there was a harrowing near miss that night, too.
Yeah, she fought back and screamed. A man passing by actually heard her scream from the woods. He yelled out into the dark to ask if she was okay.
But he didn't investigate.
No. Upon hearing no response, he just continued walking. However, another witness saw a highly athletic man sprinting from the woods right after the scream. That witness's description resulted in the composite sketch that would literally define the manhunt for the next 2 decades.
And this crime scene became the forensic nexus of the entire investigation. DNA evidence recovered from Christine Mirzayan's murder was entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS.
And that's where the connection happens.
Exactly. That DNA definitively matched the biological evidence from the unsolved rapes in Montgomery County. So the science finally proved that the Washington, D.C. murderer and the Maryland serial rapist were the exact same person.
Which, I mean, raises an agonizing question. You have a composite sketch. You have a clear DNA profile matching 10 rapes and 1 murder sitting in the CODIS database. How does a killer just vanish into thin air for over 20 years?
It exposes the profound limitations of early forensic databases, unfortunately. CODIS is really only as good as the profiles it contains. And databases in the late 90s and early 2000s, they were built primarily on the DNA of individuals convicted of significant felonies. Because Warwick had no significant felony convictions during the era when those databases were actively being populated, his DNA was never taken by the state. He was just a ghost in the machine.
So the trail goes ice cold. Even a massive digital blitz by the FBI and local police in 2011 completely failed. I mean, they put up digital billboards across 15 East Coast cities, offered a $25,000 reward, launched podcasts, and pushed social media alerts.
They heard everything.
Everything. They generated over 100 tips, but it yielded absolutely nothing. Warwick had simply packed up and moved to Conway, South Carolina, living a quiet, undetected life, and the sources reveal a really painful reality for the survivors during this decades-long wait. None of the surviving rape victims could positively identify Warwick in a physical lineup.
Which is heartbreaking. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where that 1998 Sri Lankan legal text you shared, Siriwardene of the Attorney General, becomes incredibly relevant.
I was wondering how that fit in.
Yet, that case heavily discusses the legal philosophy regarding the indivisibility of the credibility of a witness.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following the logic here. Because the victims couldn't clearly see his face due to the blankets he threw over their heads, defense attorneys can argue that their memory of the weapon or the timeline or the verbal threats is also corrupted. Like, the law treats human memory as an all-or-nothing package.
It is a foundational defense strategy.
Yeah.
The principle argues that if a witness's testimony is demonstrably unreliable on one crucial point, like visual identification, a jury cannot safely rely on their testimony for any other point.
Wow.
Yeah. If the defense, led by attorneys like Stephen Mercer in this case, can force an eyewitness to admit on the stand that they didn't clearly see their attacker's face, they introduce reasonable doubt about the entire sequence of events.
So his MO was almost like built-in legal protection.
Exactly. Warwick's tactical MO of sensory deprivation rendered human memory and eyewitness law highly vulnerable. Investigators knew they couldn't rely on human testimony to secure a conviction.
Human memory was completely neutralized by his methods, which means investigators were forced to pivot to a brand new frontier, right? Investigative genetic genealogy, or IGG. Post-2018, following the success in the Golden State Killer case, law enforcement turned to a Virginia company called Parabon Nanolabs. And the methodology here is a massive leap forward from what failed them in the 90s.
Oh, completely. Standard CODIS markers, they just look at the length of repeating DNA snippets. That is great for a one-to-one match if you already have the suspect's DNA, but it's terrible for finding relatives.
Right.
Parabon didn't use those. They used single nucleotide polymorphism, or SNP profiles.
So what makes SNPs so much more powerful for this kind of hunt? Like, how does that work in practice?
Well, SNPs look at single-letter variations across your entire genome. It's basically the difference between checking if two cars have the exact same license plate versus checking if they were built in the same factory using the same materials by the exact same family.
That's a great way to put it.
Thanks. So Chief Genealogist Cece Moore and her team, they took this SNP profile and uploaded it to public commercial genealogy databases. And they basically built a reverse family tree.
And they located a distant cousin of the suspect, right? Someone who had voluntarily submitted their DNA just to learn about their heritage.
Exactly.
From that single distant cousin, genealogists traced the branches down, narrowing the entire suspect list down to 5 men who fit the age profile and lived in the D.C. area in the 90s, and that finally pinpointed Giles Daniel Warrick.
The transition from an anonymous biological profile to a specific name is a monumental leap, and it leads directly to his apprehension.
Here's where it gets really interesting. On November 13, 2019, detectives from D.C. and Maryland traveled to Conway, South Carolina. They are surveilling Warwick's house. At 2 a.m., detectives observe Warwick turning on the lights in his home. He's restless. He's pacing around the property. They believe he is actively preparing to flee.
Right. Law enforcement refers to this as behavioral evidence of a consciousness of guilt, and what they found inside his home confirmed that instinct.
When they executed the search of his kitchen, they found a hidden firearm that his fiancée said was normally kept in the bedroom. He had moved it, staging it for quick access.
He knew they were coming.
He had to. Even more damning, they found a handwritten letter to his fiancée begging for forgiveness. He wrote, quote, "I left you in a mess. I never meant for this to happen. All my junk is yours."
But, to officially arrest him and charge him with the crimes, a genealogy lead isn't enough on its own. They needed a direct cheek swab to match the crime scenes one-to-one.
Right. They need the actual physical evidence from him.
Exactly. And to secure that swab, the Metropolitan Police Department used highly controversial, deceptive interrogation tactics.
Yeah, the defense attorney actually played audio clips of this in court later. To get Warwick's consent for the swab, a detective blatantly lied to his face. The detective promised Warwick that the DNA results would take 6 to 8 weeks to come back, telling him this was just a formality to make the situation feel less frightening.
It was a tactical deception. It was designed to keep him compliant and prevent him from demanding a lawyer immediately. In reality, they expedited the sample to a lab,
And the match came back fast.
less than 24 hours, and it came back at a staggering probability of 1 in 1.1 quadrillion that it was anyone else.
Unbelievable. And with that, the Potomac River rapist was finally in custody. But despite this monumental, decades-in-the-making forensic victory, the story ends not with a gavel, but with a massive institutional collapse.
Yeah, the ending is just
Uh,
jarring. The paradox here is crazy.
Yeah.
They used the most advanced science on Earth to catch him, but the system tasked with holding him completely broke down.
It highlights the stark difference between catching a suspect and actually delivering justice. Warwick was extradited to Washington, D.C., and held at the Central Treatment Facility, which is part of the D.C. Central Detention Facility complex, to await trial. And pulling from the Black Table Talk magazine and Washington and former sources, the conditions at this facility under Director Thomas Faust were under intense scrutiny. The reports describe an environment in total systemic failure.
Total failure.
We are talking about facilities plagued by sweltering heat, poor food quality, a severe lack of mental health monitoring, and just dangerous understaffing.
The U.S. Marshal Service had actually previously conducted surprise inspections of these facilities. They found conditions so wretched that they had actively transferred hundreds of inmates out.
Wow.
Yeah, there were documented reports of water and food being withheld as punishment, and facilities plagued by pervasive mold and vermin.
And in this environment, on November 19th, 2022, this is just 10 days before he was finally scheduled to face a jury for the murder of Christine Mirzayan Warwick, was found unresponsive in his cell at the Central Treatment Facility. He had hanged himself with a bedsheet tied to a metal locker.
The post-mortem investigations and the subsequent fallout revealed shocking statistics regarding the facility's staffing. At the time of Warwick's death, there was only one officer assigned to monitor an entire unit of 32 residents.
One officer for 32 cells.
Yes, and Warwick was the 8th person to die in D.C. Department of Corrections custody just that year alone.
Alida White, the mother of Warwick's son, spoke out extensively about this failure. She pointed out that if regular mandatory security counts were actually being conducted by the staff, guards would have missed him at least 3 times before his body was discovered.
It's a systemic blind spot.
Yeah. She, along with organizations like Harriet's Wildest Dreams, led by Kiana Johnson, point to these deaths as a fatal symptom of a deeply broken pretrial detention system. According to them, they argue that if jails do not have the basic staffing or infrastructure to keep people alive to face trial, it is a profound failure of public safety.
And we really must emphasize the ultimate bitter reality for the victims and their families here. Giles Daniel Warrick's suicide was his final, calculated act of control.
Just like his M.O.
Exactly. By taking his own life just days before trial, he permanently denied the survivors the closure, the public truth, and the finality of seeing him convicted in a court of law. The justice system held him, but it couldn't keep him alive long enough to face judgment.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? This deep dive matters because it illustrates the precarious nature of the justice system. We possess the brilliance of modern forensic science, the ability to reach back 20 years, read the very building blocks of human DNA, and solve the unsolvable. But all of that scientific brilliance was undone by the fragility of a custodial system that snatched away the resolution right at the finish line.
It leaves a permanent void for the families. And, it also leaves us with a lingering, provocative question, one drawn from that Indiana Law Journal source we reviewed on genetic privacy.
Oh, right.
We rightfully celebrate the capture of predators like Warwick and the Golden State Killer using genetic genealogy. But we have to ask, at what cost to our collective privacy?
Right, because the cousin who triggered this entire cascade didn't upload their DNA to catch a killer. They uploaded it to a commercial site just to find out where their grandparents were from.
Exactly. Commercial DNA companies like Family Tree DNA have made secret agreements to share users' genetic profiles with the FBI without warrants or subpoenas. So as you mull over the incredible science that solved this case, consider this. In our rush to uncover our ancestry, are we unknowingly acting as genetic informants on our own families? As this technology rapidly evolves, Where exactly will society draw the line between our fundamental right to genetic anonymity and the state's mandate to catch a killer?
It is a heavy question that pits our desire for safety directly against our right to privacy. Thank you so much for sharing this fascinating stack of sources with us. It really proves that the justice system isn't a linear machine at all. It's a fragile, murky pursuit, and sometimes the gears completely break down. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.